If you're anything like me, you love pens, and you may or may not be a bit of a completionist when it comes to getting them, but how do we actually keep track of all of the pens we have? And more importantly, how do we make sure that we can find the right color when we need it? Hi team, I'm Jess or Jashi Corinne on behalf of the Art Journal of Ambassador team, and today we're going to be talking about pen swatching, but more specifically some ideas to make your pen swatching as useful as possible. My first tip is to decide on the purpose of your swatch pages. If you're trying to make swatch pages just to look kind of nice or decorative, that's totally fine. It just means that the setup of that page and the layout that you use is probably going to be a little bit different to what I've got here. The purpose of my swatch pages is very much function, so being able to find the right colors or the right pens at any given point in time. If, like me, you effectively want a catalogue of all of your pens, then having it set up in this style can be really useful. Effectively what I have is a section for each of my different types of pens, and then I just have little boxes to put the swatch in, and then a space to write the name of the pen and the collection beside that. Some of my sets of pens are released in collections, so we have specific collection name and then the list of pens, whereas other ones come either as individual pens or in smaller sets that don't specifically have names, or a larger collection. If the function of your swatch pages is to see also how a pen writes, so considering the tip type and the tip size, then just doing little boxes like I have here might not be suitable. You may instead want to have a swatch where you actually get to see the stroke of the pen, in terms of how thick the nib is, or how thin you can write with it, anything like that. Because my function is really mainly around colour, and I have a pretty good understanding of what the different pen nibs are, I don't feel the need to do any kind of swatching in that way. Instead, little boxes work just fine for me. When it comes to other easy but decorative designs, you can of course use print-offs to make your swatch pages, or you could do something like paint rollers, which are quite simple to draw. It's effectively just two little boxes and a connecting line between them. Our second tip though is to organize your pen swatches in the way that you organize your pens. I typically like to keep my different types of pens separate from each other for the most part, so for instance having a swatch page for just my acrylographs organized into their different collections, because that's how I used to store them. Following a similar idea for my calligraphs, I had them done by their collection as well, but nowadays I just store all of the collections together in one space, so I know exactly where to find all of my calligraphs rather than individual sets. Another idea when it comes to thinking about the actual organization of your page and organizing it in a way that you store your pens is, do you have a specific carry case or something similar for your pens? For instance, with these Caran markers, I've swatched them in such a way that they mimic how they are in the box. A similar idea for the Tombos. This is the setup that I have in my Tombow carry case, so I can effectively use this color swatch as kind of like a map for where to find my pens. It also means that if I've taken a bunch of pens out of my carry case and I'm not too sure where I used to put them, I can come back and refer to this to help me out. Another tip is considering what information you want to include in your swatches. For some of my swatches, I do like to write down the full color name, especially if they don't have any other kind of identifier, whereas for other pens I'll just write down the color code, or the number or letter combination that's on the pen barrel. This is really just about finding those pens easier again, so I'll normally write down the information that's on the pen itself. Another tip for things to include in your swatch page is a space for your favorite pens. I've done this one based on just the Tombos, but you could have a favorite pens in general. Effectively, these are like your go-to colors, your go-to pens, the ones you use the most, so that if you're maybe out and about and you want to buy a replacement of something, you have exactly what those pens are, or if you wanted to recommend them to somebody, you've got a reference for it as well. The third tip though is considering where you put your swatches. Now, as you can see, all of these swatches are at the back of one of my Art Journal of notebooks. This one in particular I call my long-term collections journal. It's effectively a space for me to put any reference material, any layouts, collections that I'm going to be using for longer than just the span of one of my everyday journals, so that I don't have to re-swatch everything out again and again with each new journal. I just have them in here instead. It means that I really only have to set them up once and I can use them as a reference over and over again. In selecting where you're going to put yours though, do be considerate of what types of journals you typically use. I often use Art Journal of journals for pretty much everything, so having my swatches in an Art Journal of journal made the most sense. I in particular decided to put all of my swatches at the back of the notebook because at the start of the notebook I have a bunch of other collections and I didn't want my swatches to get lost in amongst these. One swatch that I do have at the front of my notebook though is done on a little tip-in. You can see this one is kind of shiny because I've put some contact paper over it just to make it feel a little bit more robust, because the actual swatch is rather large, and if it was just on a regular sheet of paper, it might feel a little bit flimsy. This one in particular though, I've put up the front here, and so that it flips out to the side, so that I can reference it from any page that I'm working on in this journal. By having it flip out, it means that it's really easy to reference, and in particular, when I like to do my headings and my borders, I want to see what colors are available in the typical pens that I use. This flip out is available as a free printable, so check out the blog post linked in the description box below to nab that one for yourself. If you want your swatches to be more of a handy reference that you can take from journal to journal though, you could consider setting this up on a separate piece of paper, kind of like a pen swatching bookmark. So having your favorite pens swatched out on this separate piece that you can either just tuck into the back pocket of your journal or actually use to bookmark the pages if you wanted to. But that could be one of the ways that you make your pen swatching reference really handy. It also means that you can take it specifically to the page that you're working on and match it against any other colors that you're using there so that you can build out a color palette that's cohesive. When it comes to my pen swatches, I do typically like to do them by pen type because that's how I like to store my pens. But what's even more helpful is doing them by color. By this I mean having a swatch page for all of your red pens, having another one for all of your orange, all of your yellow, because this is really helpful when it comes to actually using my pens. Often when I'm on the hunt for a pen, I'm not necessarily on the hunt for a specific type, but more so a specific color. For instance, if I have a particular washi tape that I'm trying to find a color match for, I want to be able to compare it against all of the pens of that color. So this one's pink. If we turn forward to the pink page, I can then have a look at this one against all of my pink pens and find the perfect color match. Of course, sometimes the color match won't necessarily be the most helpful, especially if the tip type on the pen isn't really what I'm looking for instance a fine liner versus a brush pen, but I have found this style of swatch page so super useful for making sure that I'm just using more of my pens that I sometimes have a tendency to neglect. It can also start to give me a real appreciation for any parts of my color spectrum where I might be lacking a little bit. For instance, in terms of pink, we have 2 columns and then 1, whereas if we have a look at blue, I have almost 3 full columns, and then if we flip forward to yellow, I only have 1.5. So is there actually enough variance in my yellows? Do I need to maybe go on a hunt for some other types of pens that I could include that broaden my yellow spectrum? It's totally alright if you don't have exactly the same number of each color, but I like to have range. One in particular that does feel kind of lacking for me is my red category. I would like to have some more variance in my red pens. When it comes to actually using these swatches by color though, what really matters is making sure that you know which of these colors represents which of your pens. For this, I like to just use a little code. For instance, if I'm thinking about an Archer and Olive pen, I start it with AO, and then if it's a calligraph, it's AOC. If it's an acrylograph, it would be AOA. I don't want to have to write too much in here, especially because some of the pen names in terms of their colors can be a little long, and I only have a finite amount of space. But setting up that code just gives you a little bit of a shorthand to be able to record the information you need. What does very much matter here though is making sure that your pens actually have names on them. Some pen collections, like the ones from Archer and Olive, do have actual names that go with them, and we have links in the description to the names for both the acrylographs and the calligraphs, just in case you don't have them. But sometimes pens just won't come with numbers or names, so you have to make them up yourself. I've just stuck this one on with a little bit of sellotape. Really what matters here though is being able to find those pens after you swatch them. So yes, I know that this orange is the one that I want to use, but which pen does it actually relate to? You're just doing future you a favor and making sure that you can find the pens you're looking for. Another tip that I have for your swatching is just keep it simple and approachable. When it comes to doing mine, I use pretty much the same setup every single time. So a similar style for the header, making sure that I have kind of the same size boxes, similar format in terms of the pages. So you can see that they do look very similar to each other, just because then when I need to set up a new swatch, I know exactly how it needs to be laid out. Another thing that's important to consider when doing your swatches is how your pens might look different depending on what you're putting them on. For instance, I like to pretty much use all of my pens just on white paper, so I put them all on a white paper notebook and that's enough for me. But if you're dealing with paint pens or gel pens, anything opaque enough to go on different types of paper, in particular different types of paper that you use, then having references for those is really helpful too. These can be made by just taking offcuts from notepads or maybe even the back of your other notebooks and sticking them into your swatch book and doing your swatches on that paper in particular, just so that you can see how the pens react on that paper compared to how they show up on your regular white paper. Another consideration is, how does the pen look when you do multiple passovers? This is particularly important for water-based markers. So if we do a little swatch here to show you what I mean, we can do a single pass, a double pass, a triple pass, or going over 3 times, and then maybe even a quadruple pass. Really depends on how many times you want to do it and what your notebook is actually going to hold up to. But you can see that the color of this pen changes quite a lot depending on how many times we do that pass over. So getting darker or more saturated as we pass over multiple times. This can be important to consider, especially if you're using this for functionality in terms of finding the right color match, because there's a distinct difference between the individual pass and the multi-pass. If you wanted to set up a swatch like that, what you could do is something similar to what I've got for the calligraphs here. Rather than for being multiple passes over, it's actually because the calligraphs are double-ended, so having a fine tip and a broad tip. So for me, I always put the fine tip on the left-hand side and then the broad tip on the right-hand side, but you could set up a similar thing for doing multiple passes over with your pen. So maybe 1 pass over in the left column, 2 in the next, and possibly even more columns depending on how many times you like to use your pen over the same spot. I'd love to know though, how do you like to swatch your pens? Do you have them in a separate swatch book, or do you just put them in your regular journal? Do you do them by pen type, collection, color? Let me know your system in the comments below. If you wanted tips on how to organize your pens though, then the video on the left is the next one to check out. Or if you wanted lettering inspiration to use your pens, then the playlist on the right is for you.